Arrogant bank manager mocked an elderly black woman's check. She owned the bank. It was just past 10 in the morning when the doors of the bank opened, and the city let in its usual rush of noise, hurried footsteps, and the low hum of air conditioning fighting against the summer heat outside. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Chandeliers hanging from a ceiling so high it made people lower their voices without even realizing it. This was not just any bank. This was one of the largest branches in the region, a place where wealth walked in wearing tailored suits and left in luxury cars. And then, almost unnoticed, an elderly woman stepped through the revolving doors. She was black in her 70s with silver hair pulled back neatly beneath a simple scarf. Her coat was worn at the sleeves, clean but clearly old, the kind of coat that had been mended more than once and loved enough to keep wearing anyway. She carried a small handbag, the strap slightly frayed, and in her other hand she held a plain white envelope, sealed with nothing written on the outside except a single name. She didn't rush. She didn't look around nervously the way some people do when they walk into unfamiliar, intimidating spaces. She simply walked, slow and steady, toward the back of the line and waited her turn like everyone else. Nobody paid her much attention. Why would they? In a bank like this, on a morning like this, she looked like just another retiree coming in to deposit a small check or ask about her modest savings account. The kind of customer bank employees serve out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. When her turn finally came, she stepped up to the counter and greeted the young woman behind the glass with a warm, genuine smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "I'd like to deposit this, please." She slid the sealed envelope across the counter. The teller, a young woman no older than 25, opened it politely and pulled out the check inside. Her eyes moved across the numbers once, then twice, and on the third glance her expression shifted from polite indifference to visible confusion. She excused herself for a moment and walked toward her supervisor's office, check in hand. That supervisor was the branch manager, a sharply dressed woman in her 40s, known throughout the office for her crisp blazers, her clipped tone, and her low tolerance for anything she considered beneath her time. She took the check from the teller's hand, glanced at it once, and then let out a laugh, not a polite chuckle. A real, dismissive laugh, the kind meant to be heard. She stood up from her desk and walked out to the counter herself, check still in hand, an amused smirk plastered across her face. "Ma'am," she said, loud enough for the people waiting in line to hear, "are you sure this check is real?" The elderly woman said nothing. She simply looked at her, calm and unbothered. The manager turned to a nearby employee. "Can you believe this? Someone actually thinks they can walk in here and deposit something like this." A few customers in line exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman near the front leaned toward her husband and whispered just loud enough to be overheard, "She must be at the wrong bank." Still, the elderly woman didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, hands folded in front of her, waiting, the way someone waits when they already know exactly how the story is going to end. The manager, enjoying the attention now, called over a second employee, showing him the check as if it were some kind of joke to be shared. The line behind the elderly woman grew longer. More eyes turned toward her. More whispers passed from person to person. And still she said nothing. Because here's the truth about people who carry real power. They rarely feel the need to announce it. They don't perform outrage. They don't demand respect. They simply wait patiently for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. But nobody in that bank understood that yet. As the minutes passed, more employees gathered near the counter, drawn by curiosity and the manager's dramatic reactions. What should have been a simple transaction had turned into a spectacle, with the elderly woman standing quietly at the center of it, unmoved, unbothered, and completely calm. A young security guard near the entrance, watching from a distance, felt a strange sense of discomfort rising in his chest. He didn't know this woman. He'd never seen her before in his life. But something about the way she carried herself, dignified, patient, utterly composed under public ridicule, made him uneasy about what he was witnessing. He wasn't the only one. Behind the counter, a young teller named Daniel had said very little throughout the entire exchange, mostly because he was new, and new employees learned quickly not to challenge their managers in front of customers. But watching this unfold in front of him, something in his gut told him this situation was wrong, deeply wrong. He leaned toward his manager and said quietly, Maybe we should verify the check before assuming anything." The manager shot him a sharp look. "I know how to do my job, thank you." Daniel said nothing else, but he didn't look away either. He kept watching, kept listening, and something told him this story was far from over. The manager, meanwhile, examined the check one more time, turning it over in her hands as though searching for some obvious flaw that would confirm her suspicions. "This amount," she said, almost laughing again, "this can't possibly be legitimate." She looked up at the elderly woman. "Where did you get this?" The woman met her eyes calmly. "It's mine," she said simply. "It belongs to me." The manager scoffed. "We'll see about that." She turned to Daniel. "Get me the fraud department on the phone." A hush fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Fraud. The word landed heavily in the air, dramatic and accusatory, especially directed at a soft-spoken elderly woman standing quietly with her hands folded. The elderly woman didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, as if she'd expected this all along, and took a small step back from the counter to wait. While the manager made her call, something unusual began happening, though nobody quite noticed it at first. The elderly woman's eyes drifted toward the wall behind the counter, where a large black-and-white photograph hung in an ornate frame. It showed the bank's original building from decades earlier, back when the street outside had been lined with small shops instead of glass towers. She studied the photograph for a long moment, then quietly said to no one in particular, "That photo is dated wrong. This branch opened in the spring, not the fall." Nobody heard her except Daniel, who happened to be standing close enough. He frowned, glancing at the small brass plaque beneath the photo. He'd never bothered to read it closely before. He leaned in and checked. She was right. The plaque did say fall, but he had no idea if she was right about the actual date, or how she would even know something so specific and obscure about a bank's history that most employees, himself included, had never bothered to learn. A few minutes later, the elderly woman glanced toward a set of old wooden chairs near the far wall, worn but well-maintained. "Those chairs," she said softly, almost to herself, "used to sit near the entrance. We moved them back here years ago because customers complained about the drafts near the door." Daniel's frown deepened. Who was we? He glanced around the lobby, half expecting someone else to react to what she'd said, but everyone else was too caught up in the manager's growing frustration to notice the small, strange details slipping quietly from the elderly woman's mouth. It was as if she were speaking a private language only she understood, one built from decades of memories that no one else in that building had lived through. An older customer standing nearby, a man in his 60s waiting to speak with a loan officer, found himself watching the elderly woman with quiet curiosity. Something about her calm demeanor reminded him of his own grandmother, a woman who had never raised her voice in her life, but who commanded more respect in a single glance than most people earned in a lifetime of shouting. He found himself hoping, without quite knowing why, that this story would end well for her. Nearby, a mother with a young son tugged gently at his sleeve, quietly encouraging him to stop staring. But the boy kept glancing back at the elderly woman anyway, sensing, the way children often do, that something important was happening even if the adults around him were too distracted to fully notice. He wanted to ask, but before he could, the manager returned, phone in hand, looking irritated. "They're checking now," she announced to no one in particular, as if daring the elderly woman to look nervous. She didn't. Instead, she calmly mentioned the name of a man, an old branch supervisor who had retired more than 15 years earlier. "Is Mr. Alvarez still consulting for the bank?" she asked politely. "He used to handle situations like this personally." The manager blinked, caught off guard. I don't know who that is." The elderly woman simply nodded, unbothered, and looked away again, as though she wasn't particularly surprised that the name meant nothing to the people currently working there. Daniel, however, felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this woman's calm, her precise knowledge of small, forgotten details about this very branch, didn't match the picture the manager was trying to paint. Frauds didn't usually know obscure historical facts about the buildings they were supposedly trying to scam. He wanted to say something, but he held his tongue, watching quietly as the scene continued to unfold. Minutes passed. The line grew longer still. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some choosing to leave and return later rather than stand through the tension building at the counter. Others stayed, drawn in by curiosity, sensing that something significant was happening even if they couldn't quite explain what. Finally, the manager's phone rang. She answered quickly, eager for the confirmation she was certain was coming. "Yes, this is regarding a check that came through this morning," she said crisply into the phone. "We have some concerns about its legitimacy." She listened for a moment, then rattled off the account details from the check, her voice still carrying that same confident, dismissive tone. Then she said the elderly woman's name. There was a pause. The voice on the other end of the line went completely silent. The manager's brow furrowed. "Hello, are you still there?" After a long moment, the voice on the other end spoke again, but slower this time, more carefully. "I'm sorry," the voice said. "Can you repeat that name for me?" The manager repeated it, more slowly this time, wondering if there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Another pause, longer this time. "Please hold," the voice said. "Do not let that customer leave the building." The manager's confident expression faltered for the first time all morning. "I'm sorry, what's going on? Is the check fraudulent or not?" But the line had already gone quiet, the person on the other end apparently rushing to speak with someone else. The manager lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as though it might explain itself. For the first time since the elderly woman had walked in, uncertainty crept into her expression. She looked up at the woman standing patiently at the counter. The woman offered her a small, knowing smile, but said nothing. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The manager grew increasingly restless, pacing near the counter, occasionally glancing toward the front doors as though expecting something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Then, through the tall glass windows at the front of the bank, several black luxury vehicles pulled up outside, one after another, moving with the kind of coordinated urgency usually reserved for visiting dignitaries rather than routine bank business. Doors opened. Men and women in expensive, tailored suits stepped out, moving quickly toward the entrance. Employees near the front exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had been told to expect visitors, especially not visitors who carried themselves with this kind of unmistakable authority. The revolving doors spun, and a group of 5 people entered the lobby, led by a tall, silver-haired man whose presence immediately commanded the attention of every single employee in the building. Whispers rippled through the staff. Someone murmured his title under their breath, regional president, and the words seemed to suck the air out of the room. He didn't stop at the manager's desk. He didn't ask for directions or explanations. His eyes moved across the lobby and landed directly on the elderly woman standing quietly near the counter, and his entire posture shifted, straightening, softening, filling with something that looked remarkably like reverence. He crossed the lobby in a few long strides and extended both hands toward her, taking her hand gently in his. "Welcome back, ma'am," he said, his voice warm, almost emotional. "It's been far too long." The room fell completely silent. The manager, still standing nearby, felt her stomach drop. The regional president turned to face the stunned employees gathered around, his expression now serious, deliberate. "I want to introduce all of you to someone very important," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "This is the woman who, alongside her late husband, founded this bank." For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The manager's face drained of color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Customers who had lingered nearby, curious about the commotion, stared in stunned disbelief. The teller who had first taken the check pressed a hand to her mouth. Daniel simply stood there, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and disbelief wash over him. The elderly woman, for her part, remained exactly as calm and composed as she had been from the very beginning. She hadn't come here for this reaction. She hadn't come here to be recognized, celebrated, or apologized to. She had simply come to see, quietly and without fanfare, whether the institution she had built decades earlier still carried the values she and her husband had instilled in it from the very first day. Years earlier, long before marble floors and chandeliers, long before glass towers replaced the small shops that once lined this street, she and her husband had opened the very first branch just a few blocks from where they now stood. They hadn't built it for wealth alone. They'd built it because they believed ordinary people, people who were too often overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, deserved a place where their money and their dignity would be respected. Over the years, as the bank grew from a single modest branch into a sprawling regional institution, she had gradually stepped back from daily operations, trusting the people she'd hired to carry the mission forward. She retained her ownership quietly, rarely making public appearances, preferring instead to let the work speak for itself. She remembered those early years vividly, the long nights spent going over ledgers at the kitchen table with her husband, the two of them dreaming aloud about what kind of institution they wanted to build. They hadn't set out to compete with the big downtown banks that had turned away their own neighbors for decades. They'd set out to build something different, a place where a factory worker's savings mattered just as much as a businessman's investment portfolio, where a widow depositing her husband's pension check would be treated with the same care as anyone walking in wearing a three-piece suit. Her husband had passed away 12 years earlier, quietly in his sleep, after a long illness that had slowed him down more than either of them ever wanted to admit. In the years since, she had continued visiting branches occasionally, unannounced, dressed plainly, simply to get a feel for how the institution was truly being run beneath the polished reports and quarterly earnings statements that crossed her desk. Numbers could tell you a great deal about a bank's health. But they could never tell you how a teller spoke to an elderly customer who moved a little slower than everyone else in line, or how a manager treated someone who didn't look like they belonged in a room full of marble and glass. But lately, she'd heard whispers, small complaints here and there, about how certain branches treated certain customers. Whispers about assumptions made based on appearance rather than character. And so, dressed simply, riding the city bus just as she always had, she decided to see for herself. She hadn't needed to deposit that check today. She could have done it 100 different ways, through private bankers, through direct wire transfers, through any number of channels reserved for someone of her standing. But she'd chosen instead to walk in through the front door, stand in line like everyone else, and quietly observe how her own bank treated an elderly black woman who, on the surface, appeared to have nothing. What she witnessed confirmed her fears. The regional president turned toward the manager, who by now looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her own humiliation. "I believe," he said carefully, "we owe this woman a very sincere apology." The manager's voice trembled as she finally spoke. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean." The elderly woman raised a gentle hand, silencing her not out of cruelty but out of quiet authority. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said softly. "That's exactly the point." The manager lowered her eyes, unable to hold the woman's gaze any longer. "A bank," the elderly woman continued, her voice calm but firm enough to carry across the silent lobby, "can recover from a financial mistake. It can absorb bad investments, market downturns, even the occasional fraud. But it rarely recovers from losing its character. And today I watched this branch nearly lose exactly that." The words settled heavily over the room. Even the customers who had no connection to the bank whatsoever seemed to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The regional president nodded solemnly, then turned toward Daniel, who had quietly tried to encourage caution earlier in the encounter. "You," he said, "were the only one who suggested verifying the check properly before jumping to conclusions." Daniel straightened, surprised to be singled out. "I just thought it seemed unfair to assume." "That instinct," the president interrupted gently, "is exactly what this institution was built on. Don't lose it." Daniel nodded, feeling a swell of quiet pride he hadn't expected. As for the manager, the consequences that followed were swift, though the elderly woman never once demanded punishment or revenge. She didn't need to. The truth of the morning's events spoke clearly enough on its own. Within the hour, arrangements were already being made for the manager's role within the branch to be reevaluated, her behavior having violated the very principles the bank had been founded upon. But there was no shouting, no dramatic scene of public shaming. The elderly woman didn't linger to watch anyone suffer. That had never been her intention. She simply turned, thanked the regional president for his time, and made her way toward the door the same way she'd entered, calm, unhurried, and dignified. Before she left, she paused near the counter one last time and looked at Daniel. "Thank you," she said simply, "for remembering what this place is supposed to be." Daniel nodded, unable to find the right words, and watched as she walked toward the revolving doors and stepped back out into the busy street, disappearing into the crowd just as quietly as she had arrived. In the weeks that followed, something noticeably shifted within that branch. Employees who had once rushed through interactions with customers who didn't appear wealthy or important began slowing down, listening more carefully, treating every person who walked through those doors with the same respect, regardless of what they wore or how they arrived. The teller who had first opened that sealed envelope found herself thinking about the encounter often, long after that morning had passed. She began greeting every customer the same way now, whether they arrived in a suit or a worn coat, whether they carried a briefcase or a plastic grocery bag. She never mentioned the elderly woman by name to new customers, but she often found herself quietly retelling the story to newer employees during their first week of training, watching their expressions shift the same way hers had that morning. Daniel was eventually promoted, not because of connections or luck, but because his quiet insistence on doing the right thing, even under pressure, had not gone unnoticed by the people who now understood exactly what kind of character this institution valued. Years later, when he trained new employees of his own, he told them one simple rule before anything else: treat every person who walks through that door as though they might be the most important customer this bank has ever had. Because he would remind them, one day, they might be exactly right. The story of that morning spread slowly at first, whispered between employees, then eventually shared more openly as a reminder of the values the bank had nearly forgotten. Nobody needed to exaggerate what happened. The truth was powerful enough entirely on its own. It became something of a quiet legend within the company, retold not as gossip, but as a lesson, the kind of story passed down not to embarrass anyone further, but to make sure nothing like it ever happened again. The elderly woman herself never spoke publicly about what happened that day. She never gave interviews, never allowed her name to be attached to any headlines. She had built a life and an institution on the quiet belief that actions mattered more than announcements. She continued riding the bus when she wanted to, continued wearing whatever coat felt comfortable that morning, continued walking into ordinary places dressed like an ordinary woman, because that, in the end, was exactly who she still believed herself to be, regardless of what her bank account might have said otherwise. Because in the end, this was never really a story about wealth or status or the surprising reveal of a hidden identity. It was a story about the countless quiet moments every single day when we decide how to treat people who appear to have nothing to offer us. The stranger in line ahead of us, the elderly woman with the worn coat, the customer whose appearance doesn't match our assumptions about who deserves our respect. Most of us will never own a bank, never possess the kind of quiet power that can silence a room the moment we walk in. But every single one of us holds within us the same choice that elderly woman witnessed being made and broken that morning. The choice to treat every person we meet, regardless of appearance, age, or circumstance, with basic human dignity. Because the truth is, we rarely know the full story of the person standing in front of us. We don't know what they've built, what they've survived, what quiet power or quiet pain they carry beneath the surface. And in a world that moves as fast as ours does, constantly judging, constantly assuming, it's easy to forget just how much can be revealed in the way we choose to treat a stranger. That morning, in a bank filled with marble floors and chandeliers, an elderly woman in a worn coat reminded an entire institution of something far more valuable than money. She reminded them that the greatest wealth isn't found in a vault, locked behind steel doors and armed guards. It's found in the simple, quiet moments when we choose kindness, respect, and dignity, especially when we believe no one important enough is watching. Because someone is always watching, and more often than we realize, that someone already knows exactly who we really are.